Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com. The United States is experiencing the coldest Christmas in decades. Yesterday, Casper, Wyoming set their all-time low temperature record of minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 41 degrees Celsius. Here in Cheyenne, we weren't quite that cold, but we just went through more than 40 hours below 0 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 18 degrees Celsius. Wyoming is the #1 coal-producing state in the country, and thanks to Wyoming coal and natural gas, Ruby, who's 3 weeks old today, has been able to stay warm and comfortable. But CNN says that the extreme cold is actually caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So according to CNN, we would be warmer if we didn't have the fossil fuels which we depend on to stay warm. This is a CNN segment from a similar cold snap on Valentine's Day 2021.
Now, some say a warming climate may have contributed to the extreme cold across the US last week. And what made this last storm so historic is that cold air plunged further south than normal, about 4,000 miles further south from near the North Pole. And these extreme weather events aren't just happening in the US. Take a look at this. These are camels on Saturday in a blizzard in Saudi Arabia.
CNN says that the Arctic is very warm and the ice is melting. They also say that winter is disappearing and we're going to have summer for half of the year. But for some reason, when CNN's warm Arctic air comes down to the United States, it's extremely cold. This is classic CNN doublespeak. Now let's look some more at the CNN interview with Katherine Hayhoe of Texas Tech University.
Scientists are confident that climate change is a big factor in some of the extreme weather we're seeing. Let's talk more about all of this with Katherine Hayhoe. She's an atmospheric scientist and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University. Great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I really do want you to unpack for us why a warming Arctic has an impact in Texas.
Now, as the world warms, we know that our weather is getting weirder. We know that heat waves are becoming more intense and more frequent. We know that wildfires are burning greater area from California to Alaska to Australia. We know that hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones are getting stronger and more damaging. We know that our really expensive weather and climate events are getting worse.
Katherine Hayhoe says that the climate is getting weirder and the weather is getting more extreme due to the burning of fossil fuels. Let's take a look and see if any of these claims being made are accurate. We'll start with the latest U.S. temperature data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They show that the frequency of 95 degree Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius days in the United States has declined sharply over the last 90 years. The National Climate Assessment, which Katherine Hayhoe was a participant in, shows the same thing. The frequency, intensity, duration, and peak temperatures of heat waves has declined sharply since the 1930s in the United States. In the area of the United States, which reaches 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius sometime during the year, has also sharply declined over the last 90 years. In fact, the 10-year mean of that metric is currently at a record low. CNN and Katherine Hayhoe were misinforming the audience about heat waves. Now let's look at their claims about forest fires. This graph was made from data which was available on the National Interagency Fire Center website during the first few weeks of the Biden administration. It shows that burn acreage in the United States, like heat waves, is sharply down since the 1930s. The Biden administration has since deleted this inconvenient data about climate. Katherine Hayhoe also said that forest fire burn acreage has increased in Australia, but like her claims about the United States, that is also incorrect. Burn acreage in Australia in 1974 was about 10 times larger than the 2019 burn acreage which Katherine Hayhoe was referring to. And on Christmas Day 1974, Darwin, Australia was destroyed by Cyclone Tracy. Darwin had to be abandoned for a year while the city was being rebuilt. Now let's look at Katherine Hayhoe's claims that hurricanes are getting worse. Once again, what she's saying simply isn't true. The frequency of both hurricanes and major hurricanes has sharply declined around the world over the last 30 years. Global accumulated tropical cyclone energy has also sharply declined since the early 1990s. My beautiful wife Kyrie made this typhoon graph from Japan Meteorological Agency data. It shows that the frequency of typhoons has sharply declined over the last 60 years. In 2016, the Washington Post was terrified by the record lack of hurricanes in the United States. They said, "Hurricanes large and small have eluded U.S. shores for record lengths of time. A major hurricane hasn't hit the U.S. Gulf or East Coast in more than a decade." We've seen already that CNN and Katharine Hayhoe are misinforming the public about heat waves, forest fires, and hurricanes. Now let's look at tornadoes. Strong to violent tornadoes in the United States have been much less frequent over the last 50 years than they were prior to that. Since the 1950s, the worst year for strong to violent tornadoes in the United States was 1974. On April 3rd and 4th, 1974, there were 148 tornadoes reported in the United States in 24 hours. And remember that 1974 was also the worst fire year in Australia and the year Darwin was destroyed by Cyclone Tracy. But the press didn't blame the extreme weather of 1974 on global warming, they blamed it on global cooling. According to experts, the extreme weather of 1974 correlated with an increase in Arctic sea ice. Bangladesh had a terrible famine in 1974, which probably killed more than 1 million people. Historically, global cooling has taken a terrible toll on the human race. 1974 was a very bad year for violent tornadoes, but in 2018 there were no violent tornadoes in the United States at all for the first time. But the United States wasn't always so lucky. In 1896, the United States was hit by at least 40 killer tornadoes, including the only one to cause more than 100 deaths in 2 separate cities. The most famous of these tornadoes was the May 27, 1896 tornado in St. Louis, which destroyed much of the city. 1896 may have been the worst year for tornadoes in the United States and was also a terrible year for heat waves around the world. A few weeks after the St. Louis tornado, many people there were dying from the heat. There was a global heat wave and drought which killed tens of millions of people in India and China. January 1896 was the hottest month on record in Southeast Australia. The New York Times described it as the hottest of hot waves on record. They said the temperatures in Adelaide reached 127 degrees in the shade. On January 23, 1896, almost all of New South Wales was over 100 degrees, including 121 degrees at some locations. From January 1st to January 25, 1896, Burke, New South Wales averaged over 45 degrees Celsius. Arizona had their worst heat wave on record in 1896 as well. Parker, Arizona had 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, topping out at 126 degrees on July 15th. The only other time a station in Arizona has recorded 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees was Parker in 1905. And on the East Coast, during the summer of 1896, a 10-day-long heat wave killed nearly 1,500 people in New York City. These claims being made by CNN and Katharine Hayhoe are patently false. They want their viewers to believe that extreme weather is getting worse and that it's caused by the burning of fossil fuels, but neither claim has any basis in reality. And they never allow any other opinions to be heard. Katharine Hayhoe has me and all of my followers blocked on Twitter. Apparently she doesn't like having her climate misinformation exposed. But to be fair, climate misinformation is ubiquitous across academia and journalism. Here's a new story from United Press International. More than half of Antarctica's native species will likely disappear by the end of the century if global warming continues at its current pace. But satellites show that there's been no warming in Antarctica for the past 40 years. The current pace of warming in Antarctica is 0, and these academics are projecting that's going to cause a mass extinction. These academics receive large research grants to produce this sort of misinformation and fraud. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this racketeering operation for the past 15 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, Upala, Sakura, Zen, Lightning, and Ruby on the web at realclimatescience.com. All 11 people and dogs in our household are very happy that we have fossil fuels to keep us warm.